Hello, everybody. My name is Nathan Phillips. I'm the Publius Fellow for Public Discourse at Braver Angels, and I am the MC tonight for this edition of America's Public Forum. America's Public Forum is a project that Braver Angels runs, and we've been working on it for about a year now with various other friends and partners at a rotating basis to do a couple of things. One of which is to just have another fun regular program aside from the workshops and debates that form the core of our work. But additionally, and I think this is the reason why I'm so proud and honored to be associated with this particular project inside Braver Angels, is we try here to be a bridge, not just between red and blue, not just between left and right, not just between the different diverse communities of Americans, but here specifically a bridge to connect the habits of depolarization as we work on them in grassroots Braver Angels world, to connect the habits of depolarization to intellectual world, the world of media, the world of policy, the world of magazines with very small readerships that I'm very interested in, and a few other 100 people are very interested in, but aren't always like most widely read. Connecting those worlds, right? So connect the habits of depolarization to intellectual world, and to connect the insights of intellectual world to depolarization world, right? It's something that a lot of people have asked us to do at higher levels in the past, and frankly, I just think it creates a really good kind of way to bring the different ideas at different levels of life in public together. And so I always enjoy it. I always find myself learning a lot from these conversations myself, and I hope that we can that in the course of doing this, we help others to come to some sorts of interesting realizations as well. So, and additionally, maybe most importantly, I get to work with a great team here, and talk to some fascinating people who have all kinds of fascinating ideas. So the topic for the evening is America's Public Forum: self-creation, spirituality, and politics in our social media world. That is a light topic, I guess. I'm just kidding. It is very deep, very esoteric, very philosophical. And one of the things we do here in Braver Angels, right, is we talk about like the direct political and cultural issues that people are like thinking about and working about, but we also try to take a step back, or two steps back, or three or four, or a million steps back sometimes as well, and talk about the kind of foundations of a lot of these things. And I firmly believe that that one of the beautiful things of American democracy is that we have a world where, even if you might not always be encouraged to study philosophy, to study the great questions of thought as they relate to human experience and the nature of thinking itself, even if you won't always be rewarded for that, they can still illuminate the world, and particularly our world where that knowledge is accessible to everybody, in ways that they might not always seem to be doing so. And so, so on that front, and because Braver Angels, of course, is an organization with a very practical focus, but with a very deep philosophical set of convictions about how we do what we do. We are quite honored to be joined this evening by one of the people who, to my very biased perspective, and many more very biased perspectives as well, by the way, is one of the most interesting and thoughtful and eloquent writers in the contemporary media space, on questions of what is the self, right? What are the foundational questions about different conceptions of human nature? What is spirit? What is spirituality? One of the most interesting writers on those questions, not just in the abstract sense, but also in the very practical sense of what does that look like in contemporary media culture? And what does that look like in contemporary pop culture? And how do Americans in the 21st century construct their own new ideas of that, that maybe are similar to things we've done in the past, but maybe are distinct for our social media world? And that writer is Isabella Burton. Tara, welcome to America's Public Forum. Tara has written some fascinating work. We'll put her Twitter handle in the chat later if you want to follow her there. But she is the author recently of a wonderful book called Strange Rites: New Religions for a Godless World. If you're ever looking for a for ways in which both fandom culture and Soul Cycle and various weird corners of the meme-making internet have spiritual dimensions, that's the place to look, and it's a fascinating kind of take. And she's coming out with a book coming up in 2 years in 2023 called Self-Made: Curating Our Image from Da Vinci to the Kardashians, which I'm actually quite looking forward to reading it myself. It'll be an interesting kind of thing to see. And if I can make myself a little bit more like the Kardashians, I'm not sure if that'll be a good thing or a bad thing, but it might be an effective thing. So Tara, I'll be looking to you for guidance. So Tara, welcome to the program. We are also joined by an old dear friend and colleague and co-conspirator of mine, John Wood Jr., Braver Angels' National Ambassador and Director of Media Development, and a budding public intellectual and a profound spiritual voice on a variety of subjects in his own right. John, as I mentioned, holds various hats in Braver Angels and does them incredibly well. You quite possibly receive his emails every weekend, and they're always eloquently, excellently done. John is also, if you've never seen him speak in public, one of the most powerful public speakers I've ever had the opportunity to know. But has a deep sense of various theological and spiritual traditions that I think has made just listening to him talk on various things always useful. And if you want a sense of the breadth, John has preached both at Southern Baptist conventions and New Age conventions. And so you don't always see folks who can talk to both groups, right? But John's able to do that. And that's one of the most important reasons why we have him here on this as well, to talk about some of these foundational questions. So with that, John, Tara, welcome to the program, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let's go ahead and get this started. Tara, your forthcoming book is going to be on the creation of self and the construction of self, right? And so I want to open up this conversation by asking you, like, we live in an age of social media influencers, right? The stereotype of influencers is that they're shallow, and that they're always cultivating a self-image that may or may not correspond to the reality of what they are inside, and all that kind of thing. But if I've read you right, one of the things that your argument is that is nothing particularly new, right? Like there's a sense in which we're always kind of constructing ourselves, and on social media and on the apps and stuff like that, and on LinkedIn, it's just a more explicit kind of tech media way. So can you just open us up and talk about that for a little bit? And I think that'll segue us towards the other questions we're asking tonight.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you so much for the extremely kind and flattering introduction. New-ish is sort of the way that I'd put it, which is to say that I think we do see a kind of trend, or sort of a collection of intellectual trends from, let's say, the early modern period onward, where there's a sort of idea of the self as something that can be cultivated, the self as something that can be sort of created, but also sort of, perhaps a better word is, I think I prefer the term cultivation, because there's an idea that there is something innate and inherent about us, which is, and starting, for example, in the sort of Renaissance iteration of this, it's not necessarily the soul or anything, but it's not metaphysical. There starts to be this conception of the self to do with, but not exactly identical with the rational mind, to do with, but not exactly identical with the soul, that sort of allows us to, through self-cultivation, combined with a certain kind of specialness that is perhaps granted by nature, to allow us to transcend certain social categories, which is, I think, where this idea starts. And with time, and I think particularly in the past couple of centuries, that idea has kind of morphed, particularly in the United States, into this idea that we have this obligation to cultivate ourselves that becomes increasingly divorced from a sense of self as a social being within a social network. And I mean that in the most prosaic sense rather than the Facebook sense. But that we are increasingly we are autonomous, we are individuals, and that which defines us, that which makes us who we are, is kind of very much distinct from, one might say, the circumstances of our birth or the circumstances into which we are born. Givenness is a word I really like there. And there's a sort of difficulty there, because on the one hand, you have this kind of liberating option that's sort of inherent in that notion, which is, why should, let's say, and this is again the sort of cultural narrative that's perhaps not always borne out, but the idea that, I might be born a peasant, but can become, become a king. That sort of narrative is itself, in some sense, filled with promise. And yet at the same time, I think that there is a sense that we haven't fully contended with, that what does that mean to say, who we are is distinct from our community, from our family, from, where we are in the world. And I think we culturally haven't quite successfully wrestled with that. That said, I think in the age of the internet, in the age in which we are increasingly disembodied, in a gig economy in which different elements of ourselves can be kind of subcontracted out by necessity to make a living, I think that there's an even greater impetus, not just to kind of cultivate ourselves, but a kind of requirement to do so that becomes crushing, that becomes this notion that, if we do not build our brand, if we do not market ourselves for sexual or social capital on dating sites, through, various parts of the gig economy, that we are somehow doing a sort of moral ill as well as a sort of economic one. And I think it's that specific post-internet drive to sort of commodify all aspects of who we are, or to create ourselves as both content creator and product, that I think is distinct. And so I think influencers are, a very good example. They're a very good sort of easy target, but I think that they're just the kind of extreme end of a tendency that's much, much more widespread. So I'm sorry, that was my slightly too long answer.
No. It's a lot of good grist to start with, though, and I guess at some point it opens up an interesting kind of dichotomy, right? Like on the one hand, you have the romantic kind of personality who is coming from nothing and wants to go rags to riches, and goes and fakes it till they make it, right? And so you have like a kind of Great Gatsby kind of thing, where in building this persona, right, and building something that's your ideal self and pretending to be that. Maybe in some ways it does make you that, but in some ways it can also probably be kind of hollow as well, right? And then you also have the flip side, the reverse of it, where you have folks who are very successful and very like on top of things and couldn't ask for another thing in the world, who feel like they're missing something, and so they go on these spirit quests or whatever to go find their true self, and they go explore through a bunch of different kinds of spirituality and all that kind of thing to discover, like, what am I, who am I at the bottom of this, right? It's almost as if like in American culture of the self in general, there's a kind of searching, right, that is not just it doesn't just necessarily go one direction, but you also can't escape that process of movement. Am I thinking about this right?
Absolutely. I think that there's a few sort of contradictory elements in the American conception of self that I, for one, haven't been able to find a sort of satisfactory explanation for all of them together. I think it is a contradiction. And I think that increasingly, and this is perhaps increasingly true over the past couple of decades, there's a move away from a certain kind of neoliberal, and I'm being reductionist here, but post-Enlightenment notion of the sort of universal self, such that, all people are but instantiations of a certain kind of universality. I think that we see this, and for example, in certain kinds of progressive discourse, a room for, how do we talk about lived experience? How do we talk about kind of very real differences in sort of experience, and that how that might shape you, that aren't simply a sense of, all people are rational minds that are just sort of placed in bodies whose experience sort of doesn't form who they are. So I think that there is that tension already between a certain kind of notion of the Enlightenment self and a kind of more a vision of the self that, at least when it comes to political categories, is much more willing to talk about givenness and how givenness might play a role. I think too that there's a sort of less discussed self-made man, capitalist iteration of self-making, that whether we want to sort of relate this to the sort of, actually, I want to say this a different way. I think it's this notion that on the one hand, we are free to self-create, and we should be, self-making Horatio Alger rags to riches style in order to have success. And yet there's a way in which, and this is something I'm now working on the Renaissance chapter of my book, and I'm really struck by this coding, where the idea that one is the sort of person who is able to do this is also kind of somewhat sacralized. One has a certain genius, and there's sort of the romantic notion of genius too. That nature has favored certain people with the ability to do something, and by doing it, you legitimize the idea that you are favored in this way. I think that the self-creation and even the promise of like capitalist self-creation isn't actually as democratic as it appears. Rather, I think it's a kind of post facto legitimization of an idea of there being some sort of nature's geniuses, nature's favored few. I use the term in my book like a para-aristocracy, where there isn't the sense that like all are, there's no room in the world for everybody to be a successful self-creator in a certain way. It is, on the one hand, has a sort of big leap of democracy, but ultimately is itself quite unequal. And the third element that I think is difficult as we talk about the self in America specifically is, like you used the term authentic self earlier. What is that? What is authenticity? I'm sort of suspicious of it as a concept. I've been perhaps reading too much Charles Taylor, who does a lot of work in this field. But I think the idea that sort of has come out of these questions, these unreconciled questions, is that like, how do I define who I am? Where do I get that sense? It's not, just from a kind of givenness that is given to me sort of from the outside, but it's not sort of a metaphysical force either. And where I think that is most often reconciled in the American cultural consciousness is, what do I want? What do I need? What do I desire? Which makes sense in a, hyper-capitalist cultural framework. And I think that the idea that who I am and what I want are linked sort of lends itself to a kind of self-creation that isn't necessarily conscious, or isn't necessarily like the provenance of, the self-creating genius. It's, I'm creating myself by clicking this link. I'm creating myself by buying this New Yorker tote bag. I'm creating myself by buying into, like watching the right show, having the right opinion, kind of creating myself as a kind of mini brand in dialogue with and as a curation of other brands. And I think that's sort of, I won't say that's what everyone is doing, but I think that is the point at which, in the absence of a better and more robust cultural conception of what it means to be authentic or to be who we really are, and particularly in an absence of a conception of, let's say, the good, or a vision to which we might be direct ourselves, where like our true self is something we do not have or have achieved yet, we do end up with, I would argue, a sense of the self that's just motivated by like, what do we want? And when I have what I want, I am most authentically myself. So,
well, I think this is a perfect part to bring in John, actually, because John, you spend a lot of time thinking and agonizing over some of precisely these sorts of things, right? Tara just said brought in here a bunch of the different ways people in American cultural history have engaged with this kind of question. And she's right. There's a lot of senses in which American individualism is in tension with American democracy, right? Like, how can you, like, is everybody a small, like, individual version of the universal, like the dignified human being with human rights under life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and everybody is truly equal in that? Or do people become their real selves by escaping from the herd, right? And pursuing their happiness and finding their American dream and all that kind of thing, regardless of what everybody else says? Or is there a sense of like a kind of pre-modern kind of romantic kind of thing that you are deep down, that maybe your religious tradition forged, or your social culture forged, that you couldn't escape if you wanted to. And being that to the truest degree is the best way to be yourself. John, how do you think about this kind of thing? How do you navigate this kind of question in the depolarization work that we've been doing?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I excited to be talking to Tara again. I'm excited to be here with everybody. And Luke, I wish you hadn't, I really appreciated your introduction of me. I wish you hadn't raised the bar quite so high. Because I know that Tara can clear it. I'm just going to be hanging on here a bit. But I think that so to ground it a little bit, I think that what makes this subject something that folks on this call will care about is the fact that when we wrestle with the question of what constitutes, a way of being that yields a happy life, or perhaps better said, a fulfilled life, a life that is meaningful in existence, that we would actually, want to feel possession of. The question of the self and who we are at the fuller sort of expression of our, to use the word, our authenticity, our authentic kind of identity. The question of who we are when we are most us becomes intimately tied into what does it mean to live a life worth living, right? And one thing that's sort of interesting to note about human history is that is, I think, sort of a foundational question of the modern era, and I suppose, depending on how we define modern, but sort of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment trajectory of civilization, certainly Western civilization. It's not necessarily the case that this question, I think, from my reading of history, was quite so consciously asked in the times of some of our ancestors. The Alistair McIntyre will, for instance, the moral philosopher, will write about how it is that, in the sort of, the Homeric era and so forth, and in early classical societies, you had a relationship to the people around you and to the world in which you lived, where you didn't ask questions about who you were as an individual so much, because that answer was given to you by the context in which you existed socially, right? And even conceptions of virtue, of right action, questions of, moral correctness and so forth, were answered by equating your purpose in life, in existence, with your function within society. If you were a person who existed as a soldier or as a landowner, there were certain ways of being that accorded with your role in the world. And that essential instinct to find who we are as individuals, perhaps not even wrestling with the concept of individualism so much, but taking it for granted that who we are as a consequence of our being a strand within the larger fabric of social and societal existence in which we find ourselves. That way of looking at the world was, I think, ultimately challenged by, sort of classical liberal notions of the self, but still, survived, and in some respects survives today. And to a certain degree, that's what Russell Kirk was trying to recapture. And Luke, I've been sort of revisiting this book, but in the book, the Conservative Mind, which really was the book that launched, kind of in a more sort of, conspicuous way, the formal conservative movement in the United States. And this was only in the 1950s or so. But, part of what Kirk talks about, and talking about folks like Edmund Burke and others, was this idea that what conservatism in part seeks to preserve is this idea of society wherein we find our, I don't know if he I don't think he used the word identity exactly, but where we find our existence in the context of the hierarchies and the social structure of human societies, societies that themselves, in Burke's analysis, and I think that probably in Russell Kirk's viewpoint as well, are mere imitations of the larger design that God puts in place, that the Creator puts in place. And so it's worth identifying that tradition and how it is that it sort of collides a little bit with the emerging, what I think of as a sort of, a classically or traditionally sort of liberal sense of the self and the sovereignty of the self. Because I think that in that in that collision, you see a tension between two impulses that I think we oftentimes maybe feel as if we have to choose between, but that ultimately, I would imagine at least, need to be reconciled and integrated within each of us if we are going to find our authentic selves, if you will. And that is simply this question of, who are we unto ourselves, but also who are we in the context of one another. And while it's easy enough to put that forward as a dichotomy or as as a contrast, there's probably not an easy way to unravel or to disentangle those two questions from one another. I tend to suspect that the answer to one has to be found in within the other in some way. Um, Tara mentioned the fact that our I'm not gonna put it quite as you did, Tara, but you said something along the lines of our search for the truer self finds itself in some ways, I think, either complicated or perhaps diminished by the fact that we've lost a larger conception of what the good is in life and in reality. And what part of what that indicates, the idea of our losing a larger, more transcendent sense of what goodness is and what the good is part of what that indicates to me is this idea that we have lost a little bit of our sense of what it means for us to be good to one another, what it means for us to be virtuous, to be loving, to relate to one another in a way to where we contribute to one another's mutual flourishing. And part of what I think comes in place of that is a world in which we reduce what used to be sort of the ancient and the higher sort of contemplations over what is good in a metaphysical and a spiritual and an overarchingly sort of virtuous sense, with a definition of good functionally speaking that equates goodness to having the right political opinions, perhaps having the right sort of social points of view, having the politics of the in crowd, if you will. And so we reduce our understanding of goodness in that way, and therefore our conception of the self um, doesn't have much to latch on to in terms of ways of being that emphasize our ability to serve one another in the context of the roles that we occupy. So where we load up significance in political opinions, we load up significance in our aesthetic sort of displays. Part of what I was thinking when I was listening to Tara was that it's interesting how influencers hold this place in our societal consciousness where they set fashionable trends both in terms of how they present themselves visually and aesthetically, in terms of how they think. And it made me think about how so much of our relationship to this idea of individualism has come to resolve in our physical appearance. And so you get this kind of paradox where suddenly a person gets a tattoo so they can stand out as an individual. A person colors his or her hair so they can stand out as an individual. And suddenly everybody's getting tattoos and everybody's hair is getting colored. And the effort to look like an individual, we all wind up looking the same or some, variation of a type, right? Um, because our sense of what it is to be an individual doesn't go deeper than that. And yet there is still a clear way in which the conscious sort of focus on the idea of recapturing some deeper sense of who we are as an individual is itself historically, I think, a response to the stifling circumstances within which social conformity is heaped upon us through religion, through authoritarian societies, or just constricting family and social structures on the local level. We start focusing on what it is to be an individual when the community and the collective bears upon us in a way to where it crushes our sense of being able to discover flourishing within ourselves. But then we emerge so much into an individualistic worldview that we fail to be able to see the world in terms that connects us to people who are out there in society and in the culture with whom we share the architecture of a civilization. And so that's why I say I think that there's a balance and integration that needs to be discovered, where in our individual virtues, we can find the ways in which we most aptly serve and love one another. And in so doing, we find what is truest and best in ourselves, unto ourselves, but in relationship to one another as well.
It's almost as if in some ways an excess of communal and cultural belonging and responsibility is the thing that makes the desire for individualism, and an excess of like individuality and choice and ability to be whatever you want to be is one of the things that creates the desire for community and belonging and tradition and kind of stuff like that. In a lot of ways, John, what you just said through here, and it segues right to the things that Tara brought up earlier, is in some ways these are different ways of being human, right? Different ways of relating to society that at some historical periods or others have been stronger in some parts of society and weaker in other parts of society, and at sometimes have been stronger at some times and weaker at other times, right? Tara, can you talk about what this means, I guess, in the broader social senses, right? Like, how does this bubble up into either actually explicit religious movements or movements and like trends that are not explicitly religious, but maybe have some of the functional dynamics filling where religions sometimes have been. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I think that certainly what this kind of particular individualism, that's a kind of creative individualism, that's both about the self-desire and the sort of way in which we create our identities by consuming and putting together different kind of aesthetics associated with different brands or different, as John said, opinions, or the right opinions. All of this, I think, has lent itself, and this is what I argue in my book, Strange Rites, to a kind of remixing of religion, which is to say, I mean, this is true of every other element of our lives. Why shouldn't it be true of religion? I'm sure all of you, or I hope some of you, have seen the Gallup poll that came out a couple of days ago that said that for the first time, a minority of Americans belong to a religious institution. I think church, synagogue, or mosque, the poll looked at. So about the same number of millennials in particular, so 48%, I want to say, belong to a house of worship. Among millennials, that's 36%. So as many millennials belong to a house of worship as 36% also say they're religiously unaffiliated. So we're seeing just a massive move away from institutional religion, and I would argue institutions more generally. Wider polling about, for example, public trust in the police, the military, the journalistic establishment, the pharmaceutical establishment. On all of these, younger Americans score as massively more mistrustful than, let's say, boomers or members of the greatest generation. So I think it's wrong, however, to say that we are a more secular society. I think what's really happening is that the spiritual life, the moral life, as well as the aesthetic life, as well as any other life you could name, is moving both. It's more individualistic, but it's also more, I think, not simply in the sense of people are more individualistic, but the sense in which the idea that I or you or anyone white might want to mix and match various practices, ideas, political philosophies, moral philosophies, to find those that sort of suit them or that feel authentic. Again, going back to the sort of vision of authenticity as something quite intuitional and emotional. I think we're seeing that kind of, each of us starting our own religion in a sense. And I do think that said, given that we are social beings and do tend to want to be in community with one another, I think we are seeing coalescing of, let's say, our spiritual impulses, our moral impulses, or even just a sense of who we are, our impulses in terms of our sense of identity, coalescing around other perhaps political movements. And I want to be careful here. I think sometimes when the people talk about social justice as a religion, this is often just like exclusively pejorative and like, oh, these woke zealots. That's not what I mean here. But I think that the social justice movement more broadly is a really powerful example about how, in the lack of a explicitly theistic or even sort of metaphysically loaded structure, a kind of ideology about justice, about goodness, about knowledge, what can we know, and how does the way in which we are kind of situated in the world inform our knowledge. These are the questions religions ask, and the fact that these questions are being asked in it's sort of not a theistic framework, but it is certainly one that has a sense of a transcendent good. It has an eschatology, a vision of a better world where certain kinds of structural oppression are eradicated. And of course, this is reductionist in that there is no official canon, no official doctrine, but I think that there's a way in which political visions of the good. I think actually it's an example too of how, if there is a robust claim to the good, to justice, to betterness, this is actually something that people do hunger for. And I think for all that we are quite isolated and individualistic, as I've said, political movements that offer a vision of the common good are themselves attractive for that very reason. And I think that said, I think that we've also seen coalescing other movements, other political movements that I think are perhaps less oriented to the common good. I think certain sort of right-wing internet rabbit holes certainly being one. And I think there the move is a bit different. I think that there's a kind of nihilism, I'd argue an aesthetic nihilism, that the sort of eschatology is often not like we will live in a juster, fairer world, or even we will turn back the clock and live in like some golden age 1950s. It's often an aesthetic of like, we're going to tear down the system, but there's this kind of like Mad Max apocalyptic element to it, which I think is I would argue sort of deeply, deeply nihilistic, in part because it sort of takes a lot of it promises a certain kind of spiritual fulfillment, or in sort of drawing people into a kind of collective effervescence and say, be part of this battle. And January 6th was one such example. But it offers simultaneously like a fantasy of a kind of moral action or collective action, combined with the kind of aesthetic fantasy of like being, I'm going to embarrass myself, Bruce Willis in Die Hard. I forgot the character's name. But that kind of like, Mad Max-esque, Bruce Willis-esque, anti-hero, transgressive, exciting, sexy. And I think that's another way in which those impulses can be harnessed. And I think on a much less broad level, I think we're finding that communities are forming differently. We're not forming along church lines or familial lines or neighborhood lines. They're forming, whether it's fandom or a hobby or a kind of, and through the ease that the internet has provided, other forms of like affinity that allow us to discover one another. And I think it means that our social ties, such that they exist, our group social ties, tend to be on grounds that are either sort of, or are chosen, perhaps is too strong a word, but based on sort of things we might learn, discover about ourselves that aren't given to us at birth.
So to be clear, I believe Bruce Willis's character in Die Hard was either John McClane or John McBain. I think one of those is his parody in The Simpsons, but it's one of those.
McClane. It's
McClane.
McClane.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for clarifying that. So, and actually, no, I love this, and it's fascinating. I've been mulling over the question of nihilists as a religious and semi-religious impulse in just social and political thought, but I also think the question of like the common good, right? The question of maybe not explicitly old line liberal movements in the name of the common good, but like kind of like communalistic, communitarian, maybe even collectivistic movements in the name of the common good has been a thing on the American political scene since before the founding, right? Great Awakenings, all that, little groups trying to set up utopias out west and all that kind of thing. But you know, so I'm politically conservative, right? I read various conservative magazines. It's my before Braver Angels, that was the main community I inhabited politically. And nowadays, as I look around the conservative intellectual policy world, I think a lot of there's kind of a parallel religious question, or not religious per se, but like civil religious question, right? Like the people who were dominant in the 1980s and the 1990s and the early 2000s in conservative world, a certain kind of libertarian, a certain kind of neoconservative, a certain kind of what they call fusionists, they're still around, but they kind of have the feel of they're like the old men in the room, you know. They're not the most influential all the time. They're not always the most energetic in terms of policy stuff, because they're working on ideas that are somewhat old. But a lot of the energy in conservative policy world, and a lot of the places where a lot of my fellow millennial conservative thinkers are going, are things that are very explicitly not that. Like one of the coolest things you can do if you're a young millennial conservative is reject Ronald Reagan, right? In the name of G.K. Chesterton and traditionalist Catholic integralism, or in the name of Theodore Roosevelt and the new nationalism and what that means for trade policy and labor policy. And then there's always these kind of back to the land types, and there's various new breeds of libertarians of different sorts that I never expected we would see. And so it's just interesting to me, because even barring necessarily going all the way to the nihilistic point, I feel like there's also a part in just general American politics and general American social culture. And maybe this is partly because, as G.K. Chesterton said, America is a nation with the soul of the church, right? And there's a almost religious aspect to a lot of our politics, even when we don't think about it that way. That kind of takes that religious dynamic of the old creeds kind of start to appear decadent to rising generations, and those rising generations go to new things that they think give them a different sort of meaning, right? Maybe there's a kind of cycle in here that we should all be thinking about at some point, and we should open that up in a later conversation, because that could easily eat up the next hour and a half. In the meantime, I want to take this conversation back to John before we go to the Q&A. John, Tara just brought up a lot of interesting things and a lot of important heuristics on the way these searches for meaning and ways of having communally embedded meaning hit people in social movement ways. Obviously, you are the national ambassador of the organization hosting this, Braver Angels. Braver Angels, among other things, engages in a lot of different social movements and works at the level of social movement rather than political movement in a lot of senses, right? Can you give insight on what that has meant, what that looks like, how you think about that in some sense as one of the chief strategists behind that? And everybody, just so you know, we'll be going to Q&A in about 5 minutes, so be prepared to raise your Zoom hands. Also, feel free to check me questions, and that might encourage me to call on you, sir. But John?
Yeah, well, I think that the foundational sort of assumption and understanding with which I and I think we at Braver Angels enter into our work is that ultimately so much of what motivates human beings, and certainly Americans, to put their hands on the wheel of democracy and turn it one way or another is not merely an abstract commitment to a certain policy or even cultural outcome, but a desire to engage in meaningful work that bonds us more closely, you know, with our fellow man. And so, you know, in that sense, our work has an interesting kind of flavor to it, because on the one hand, Well, we are sort of an organization and a community working in or as a movement seeking to re-equip the American people with the abilities to reestablish connections and relationships with one another. Um, but in so doing, we are also, taking advantage of the fact that this impulse is already there with people. Um, our current polarization doesn't so much stem from the fact that we have ceased to want to connect, even across lines of differences, if you will. Um, Rather, I think it is, in part at least, a result of the fact that for various different reasons, we don't have the shared vocabulary, cultural frame of reference, and otherwise tools and ability to build these connections over certain gulfs. Where we seek to build them, where we seek to find community, we attach ourselves to political movements that inevitably are given some impetus, some fuel by the fact that folks want to find connection, and part of what motivates us to find connection and act in concert with one another as groups is our response to common threats, our response to the idea that there's some shared enemy or boogeyman out there against whom we have to rally. My friend George Halverson at the Institute for Intergroup Alignment has this interesting pyramid that sort of goes through the different ways in which groups are motivated to work together. It sort of mirrors Maslow's hierarchy of needs for the individual. Um, but some of the higher motivations on that group pyramid are motivations that have to do with us believing in something aspirationally together that we can articulate together, something that can provide the basis for some relational communion, if you will. And so the idea that there's some higher good to be striven towards, that maybe speaks to the level at which we can achieve some shared flourishing in humanity is implicit in most social movements, because as Tara was sort of explaining, just for instance, in the context of the social justice movement, the modern social justice movement, you can see sort of an endpoint to this vision that says that, okay, we have to recognize the original sin of, let's say, white supremacy and American society, but by becoming enlightened to that issue, we can act against it in the context of activism, and therefore achieve an anti-racist outcome for society. That the expectation is will, it, the implication is, would lead to a world in which we can more truly flourish. And I'm just trying to describe that outlook as neutrally as I can. We could say something similar about populist movements, nationalist movements on the right, etc. Um, but in the context of our work at Braver Angels, that higher kind of endpoint is a little bit, I think, more explicitly sort of named. And in the way I talk about our work, certainly in particular, I make frequent use of the language that comes out of the American nonviolent tradition, the language of Martin Luther King Jr., and this concept of the beloved community. We seize on that concept at Braver Angels. We seize on the idea, the concept of a more perfect union. We seize on the concepts that in our history that indicate, if not an end point to democracy exactly, then a point of higher sort of, you know, communal realization, to, jump off the idea of self-realization, but communal realization, wherein beyond any particular policy or social outcome, as far as, laws and social conventions are concerned, we come to a place of relationship and co-creation of our shared civic reality with each other that is rooted in our having achieved a greater level of goodwill for one another, a greater level of trust for each other, and that the beloved community, the more perfect union, is itself a product of our having more deeply um, reached into one another's hearts and pulled forth therein the better angels of our respective natures. And so that, in the context of Braver Angels work, is, I think, a little bit more explicitly sort of identified as the endpoint, but in some way, all social movements are aiming towards something like that, you know. But again, when we lack sort of the terminology to sort of transcend the narrower sort of policy or political sort of objectives of social movements, we come to think of ultimate good as only going so far as a political agenda may go, and we fail to be able to imagine an endpoint that exists, you know, perhaps in harmony with the particular political agenda, but that nevertheless resides sort of a level beyond it in some way. And it is, you know, it maps on to sort of the difference in individual relationships between viewing your relationships in purely utilitarian terms, having a functional relationship with your friends, wherein a friend is merely somebody who is willing to, you know, help push your car out of a ditch because you may be willing to help them move a couch later on down the line, to a relationship wherein this trading of favors is itself a reflection of the fact that there's some deeper love between me and my neighbor, right? And that can bleed into other things because it's felt. It's not just a mere matter of utility, a mere matter of the function of exchanging favors, if you will. So yeah, I mean, I would like to think that we work within the natural aspirations of human nature in our work at Braver Angels, and that is a deep part of what I hope, at least, makes our efforts both effective and perhaps compelling.
I do want to point out that for those who have never had your car stuck in a ditch, it is always quite helpful to have a friend who can help you pull your car out of the ditch, whether there's love there or not. Love always helps. So, well, I hope over the course of the last hour, I've helped to demonstrate through this conversation why Tara is helpful to me on all kinds of fronts and understanding the things that I'm wrestling with and struggling with, and also why I think a lot of her work is relevant and useful for helping develop our own thoughts as well, both in terms of what Braver Angels is doing, but also more broadly in what we each individually kind of are living in this this still enchanted world of ours, you know. And so Tara and John, I appreciate you guys being here. We're going to go to Q&A now. We will have about 20 to 25 minutes available for Q&A, everybody. In order to get as many questions in as we possibly can, I ask you to keep your question to about 45 seconds to a minute, and please ask it so far as is possible in the form as a question if you possibly can. And
I'll do my best not to take 45 minutes to answer.
Much appreciated, John. There will be opportunities for that later on. So we'll go through as many questions as we can. Please say your name, where you're calling in from, your question, and who your question is for. Let's start off from the top. So Linda Coulterberg, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi there. So I have both kind of a statement and a question. I agree very strongly. I'm from Florence, Oregon, before that Colorado, and went to school with philosophy and political science and business background until I had to quit. I have dealt with a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, trying to bring some discussion around this. And what I'm witnessing here is that the dialogue that I'm hearing would fly 2 miles above the heads of a lot of the people that I talk to. So to find that common ground, what are you doing to make sure that you're using words that actually engage people where they are in the various communities? Because someone who doesn't have a college degree is not going to, they're going to tune out in the first 5 minutes of this conversation.
Well, this is an excellent and important question for this, and especially given the nature of our work. John, Tara, do either of you guys want to take that one right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the simple answer to that question, Linda, is that at Braver Angels, at least, we have different events and different contexts within which we operate, right? And so, you know, at our Braver Angels debates, for instance, which are, you know, community debates where folks from all walks of life are able to come in and give a position on a certain issue on the table. You're going to hear from folks in short bursts in the same language you would use to talk about anything, pretty much. I think that the America's Public Forum event, as Luke was talking about at the top, is sort of designed a little bit to give us space to lean into the headier sorts of subjects in a headier sort of way. But with our workshops, the things that we do in grassroots communities and most college campuses and whatnot, the idea is to give people space to be authentic, to speak in the terms that resonate with them. And so we're not always talking about classical liberal philosophy and metaphysics and that sort of thing, but it's fun to do it now and again.
I wouldn't get that up all day long, but I know that there's about 3 in my town that would.
Sure.
Tara, I'd be curious what you think specifically too on that question, because it's true, you do engage at a very high level, right? So to what degree do you think the way this kind of stuff is talked about is important for your everyday Joe like the rest of us, right?
Who are you asking?
Tara.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think maybe this is sort of the idealist in me that I think thinking about the questions of who we are, what makes us who we are, these are human questions. And I think, we don't have to talk about the jargon of classical liberalism. Is I think at its best, this kind of language is helpful because it helps it helps with precision in a conversation. But I think fundamentally, and a really great book on this, Zena Hitz's book, Lost in Thought, is a sort of I think a defense of why the ability to think about these questions and ways in which we foster talking about what it means to be human, in her book, talking specifically about reading and the humanities and why this is helpful. But I think that there is a sense of the way I see it, at least, is that our inner lives, the space we have to think about ourselves and the world, that's a really vital part of who we are, not because we are rational thinking beings, but because part of the dignity of being who we are is that little space to consider who we are in our lives. And I think that, of course, certain kinds of jargon can be alienating, sure. And I think that certainly, obviously the audiences that I tend to write for tend to be audiences more well-versed in that jargon. But I do want to defend the notion that the question of what do you want to be part of something bigger? What does that look like for you? For a lot of time, that is work that has often been done in, religious settings. Those are questions that have been asked and, sort of in both in terms of human history, but also in terms of communities that are not, defined by their education level, say. So I think I'd like to just make a little bit of an optimistic push in the sense that these are questions that we should be asking, that we should not be limiting to a certain kind of person, even as I take the point that certain kinds of language, the language is only useful when it's useful, and when we're trying to sort of narrow down an issue, and if it's not useful, we jettison it.
Actually, Tara, I think we've got ourselves a whole nother idea for another APF at some point in the months in the future. So let's touch base on this sometime soon. So let's go to the next question. Kay Halpern. Kay, unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Okay. So I was very taken by what, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was very taken by what John was saying, and especially when he contrasted the aspirational with, I guess, what I'd call kind of a more threat-based identity, and the aspirational being, the beloved community that MLK described. And so I guess my question is, it's a cliche, but one of the reasons it's a cliche is because it's so true. I'd like your reaction to the concept that it can't really be about the destination. It's got to be about the journey. Because whenever kind of any aspirational movement has tried, or claims to reach a destination, think of like the Soviet or the Chinese version of communism, which doesn't really work, or didn't really work in the case of the Soviet Union, and has a lot of problems in the case of China. That it's about trying to achieve a more, striving for a more perfect union. And it's the emotions that you're feeling when you're striving for something, when you're on a journey that, you haven't arrived. That's when you're more likely to go help someone get their car out of a ditch. That's the frame of mind that you're in. And so I just like your reaction to this idea that, it's more about the journey than the destination. Because we're destinations, we always fall short.
Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I agree, and I deeply resonate with that illustration. I think it speaks to a what for me at least is a deep moral principle or spiritual principle even, which is that ultimately ends have to be consistent with means, which is something that Dr. King emphasized greatly in his teachings. There is a clear way in which both social and individual morality suffers when we think merely in terms of outcomes, right? And I think that the state of our politics, broadly speaking, is a testament to that, because we are short-sighted enough to think that if we can pull or manipulate the levers of power and influence in society in just the right way, we can get our side to the position of power in governance, failing to consider the consequences of having broken trust with, with half or maybe more than half of the American people on the way to that position of power. Because even when you're in a position of power, you still ultimately have to operate that power in concert with the basic level of trust or consent or buy-in that exists among the governed. But, we can look at individual relationships in the same way. Or small scale relationships. I might be able to con my way to being, to taking over as the managing vice president of some company. I may be able to to manipulate earnings reports or performance reviews or what have you. But if folks have the sense that that's what I did to get to where I'm going, then they're not likely to turn around and work with me with any degree of good faith or affection in the aftermath. And so this is the difference between approaching life and morality from a standpoint of virtue and an internal disposition of goodwill versus trying to navigate all of our relationships through the raw calculus of power or functional outcomes. We have to be able to harmonize the outcome that we wish to see, an outcome of flourishing, with an internal reality of goodwill and flourishing as well.
Well, John, I am very happy that I was successfully able to manipulate your thinking into you saying specifically that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just kidding. That was a joke. So, okay, well, let's go next to Rita Chisholm. I'm trying to keep this as much in the order of which the hands were raised as possible. So, Rita, if you can ask your question and keep it to 45 seconds or a minute.
Okay, that's going to be hard. But first of all, I want to say hi to Lauren. He was my new friend that I met the other day at a skills workshop. I want to say that I understand that my lens is not necessarily the lens that everyone here, is looking through. So I appreciate that. I'm a Christian. I'm a Christian that was raised as a cradle Catholic from my childhood. But my mother, and this is very important, my father met her in Italy and brought her back to the States at 19 years old, brought her to Central Mississippi in 1958, when being Catholic, Black or anything other was very unpopular. So my mom actually had to learn how to speak English by watching American television. What I was taught in my home was very basic, that we were all children of God. We contained the spark of him within us, and that by that mere fact, we were to respect everyone, every other human being because of that fact. But I've had a burning question on my mind that has to do outside of even Christianity. Jesus was asked by the Pharisees, what is the greatest commandment? And when Jesus answered that question, it was very, he was very clear. You're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you're to love your neighbor as yourself. I'm very confused when we know as Christians that this is what we've been tasked to do. Why is it that we don't, why is it that it's so difficult for even those that have been tasked to do this directly struggle with that? And the other part of it is, have politics taken over the role of God in our society?
An excellent and important question, Rita, and you kept it reasonably within limits. So I appreciate that a lot.
Thank you so much.
John, Tara, either of you guys can respond to that, whichever you prefer first.
Sure. So I think the why don't we do what we should do is, I think, I speaking as a Christian as well, so much at the heart of sort of my understanding of sin, whether it's, Augustine and the Pairs or what have you. I think just because we know that something is the right thing to do, and I think very few people, very few self-identified Christians, if you said, are you supposed to love your neighbor as yourself? Wouldn't be like, yeah, sure. Although they might come up with excuses why, well, yeah, okay, but I said my neighbor, they didn't really mean that person, and loving, I love them, but that doesn't mean I should help them. And I think there's a lot of ways in which we as fallen, broken people fail to do what we ought to. And I think that's the sort of Christian theology answer, but I think a broader sociological answer is, I think, the way in which Christianity in America has been through being both institutionalized in the sense of becoming a political institution. Particularly, I'm thinking of the alliance between white evangelicalism and the GOP, the moral majority, and that kind of strand, but also speaking more broadly, although this is by no means exclusive to America. But I think that when institutes of state power and Christianity intersect, the results have historically not been great for the gospel, which is to say, when and this is where I think I absolutely do agree that sort of the way in which politics takes the role of religion in our lives. Part of it is, I think, this idea that in an increasingly quote unquote secular or unchurched age, politics are replacing religion. I think that is true. But I think it's also fair to say that always when our political identities as members of certain kinds of in-groups being based on whether it's race or nationality or class, ways in which I think political senses of self and senses of other have always intersected with religious institutions. One might easily say that politics has been our religion for longer than the decline in organized religion in America.
That's actually a wonderful way to put it there. I appreciate that particular answer to this question as well, too. John, do you have anything to say to this?
I think that what I would just say very quickly is that it is very difficult to love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's a high command. It's a high calling, and I think that, there are all sorts of external circumstances that we can identify and rationalizations that rise up to sort of give us excuses for not consciously centering that commandment in the foreground of how we live our lives. And so that becomes, disturbing, right? Because I think that I think within the church, there's such a, even if it's implicit, sort of a hyper contextualization of a sentiment like that, to where it functionally only seems to exist between you and, you know, the people who you more or less get along with anyway. And, you know, as Jesus said, you know, what credit is there for those who love people who, you know, who love them, you know? Do not the Pharisees do the same? I'm butchering the quote a little bit. But I do think that, you know, a theme of our conversation here today has been sort of the way in which politics has kind of slipped into something of, I guess you could say, an idle sort of position, you know, in our psychology, and for, you know, some reasons that I guess we've talked around a little bit today. But you know, it is interesting. Tara talks about how we sort of create our own religions in American life, whether we refer to them as religions as such or not. And it's sort of natural that should be the case in democratic societies such as ours, because in the United States, obviously the right to participate as full citizens has, you know, been narrower and has expanded over time. But the promise of the country is that you have some opportunity to be to exercise some direct say over the direction of the country and your community, et cetera, et cetera. And in that context, as the basis for, you know, for more traditionally anchored forms of belief recedes, we find meaning in the things that we can control or think that we have some control over. So I think that that's probably an aspect of what it is you're referring to here.
Thank you, John. I just want to make a quick announcement as well, because we get questions about this every once in a while. So to be absolutely, completely transparent and clear, Braver Angels is not a sectarian religious organization. We meet people where they are on levels of religion and faith and spirituality, precisely where they are and how they conceive themselves. There are people of all faiths inside Braver Angels. I'm Catholic. We have a lot of Protestants. We have a lot of Jewish brothers and sisters in here. We have Muslims, including Ibrahim Anli, one of the gentlemen here doing Zoom stuff for us here. We have Muslims in here. We have Hindus in the organization. We have lots of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not necessarily N-U-N-S. Although I think, John, I wouldn't be surprised if we have some sisters of various orders in here as well. So just so everybody is completely aware, we bring up religion in American life here, not out of any proselytizing purposes, not out of any senses of trying to change anybody's minds or convert anybody's souls to anything in particular, but out of a sense that it's a place where a lot of us of all religions and none and of some, and of just all these different ways of engaging with faith life, as you can see over the course of the conversation in this event. We engage at a religious level on religious topics because it hits people where they are, and we view that as crucial to the mission of depolarization and bringing Americans together across all of our divides, religious and otherwise. So just to make sure that that's entirely clear and on the record here. So meantime, we have time, I think, for about 2 more questions. I'm going to go with the people who I had seen in the queue first, and but we will have to cut questions right at 9:25. So I apologize, we won't be able to get to everybody's, but we'll do our best to get through these next 2. So next person on the list was Dave Suma. Dave, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, hi, Dave from California. I've been a part of Better Angels before it became Braver Angels, and fully support the mission, mostly because I was in need of dialogue and conversation just to figure out what's going on. Traveled an awful lot around the world and saw the tectonic forces going on since about 2012, and resulting in elections all over the world tilting. But one of the things I've learned in my life is that there's a difference between values expressed as nouns and values expressed as verbs. And one of the things I'd like to discuss today is people value advertise and talk about morality. But putting into action is a completely different thing. I had a chance to travel to Rwanda. Place I never wanted to go, but I know they. Yeah, sorry. And what they do to get over genocide was to clean. They get out in the streets and clean together, everyone side by side, regardless of ethnicity. And one of the things I wanted to ask is of braver angels, is there a way for us, and I want to riff on the first question, is there a way to have forums on policy where people can talk about what they would do, not talk about where they are, which I appreciate, hugely important, but add a second dimension to this, values in action, not just values of to understand, and to find common ground through values in action.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I did this in climate change around here, and I got people on the left saying we have to do something, we need a carbon tax, and the people on the right to say, no, but if you take the carbon tax and retire debt, suddenly they were on board.
Yes,
so it's just an
Dave,
example.
If I can jump in just in the interest of time, but yes, well, first of all, we're in the process of rolling out a new workshop presently. I'm not sure if this has been announced yet or not, but we have a workshop that we're rolling out for popular online participation, which is aimed at exactly that, which is stimulating policy-based conversations for people to come together on, discover common ground, and then collaborate on going forward if they choose to do so. But these conversations also take place on the local level within Braver Angels already, within the context of some of our local Braver Angels alliances. I don't know if you're part of or connected to Braver Angels Alliance near you. Some of them are active, though, in terms of talking through policy and exploring ways to actually advocate where there's some bipartisan consensus. So it is a part of what we do, but it is going to be more and more a focus, I think, as we move along.
And Dave, the America's Public Forum program will be happening every Wednesday between now and who knows when. And some of them will be definitely more policy oriented. So look forward to hearing back from us on those, but we will definitely be doing some of these here. All right, so for the last question of the evening, we're going to go to Mimi Yang. Mimi, would you like to unmute yourself, ask a question? Please keep it under a minute or 45 seconds if you can.
Sure, don't worry. Look, first of all, congratulations for setting up this forum, especially the topic self-creation, spirituality. I found it's very timely. Okay, number two, I want to comment for you also. Look, you know, the first person asked the question, how to bridge different groups of audience, right? I'm saying do not worry, because both Tara and John, they are high-minded thinkers. So if someone can translate the concepts into concrete, specific stories, tangible things, you know, the same truth can be told in different versions. So I think Brave Angels have opportunity to work towards that. So now, because I'm also from a philosophical humanities background, let me ask a conceptual question to the two presenters. You know, both talked about how to be self-created. Now, the self-creation in the postmodern era, especially now, is much more complicated. You mentioned the technology, you mentioned industry, you mentioned the social media. I mean, I see all of them. But at the bottom line, when you claim a self-identity, there's a lot of intersections. For instance, gender, race, or transgender. You know, people just cannot make out a coherent self-creation. So the challenge is very close to 50 years ago or 100 years ago, right? So action in this intersection in the process of self-creating.
Mimi, I think your audio broke out a little bit there, but John, Tara, did you guys catch the majority of the question?
I think I got the thrust of it. Yeah, we lost you a little bit at the end there, Mimi, but I think that your question got to how is it we can form a coherent identity in the conflicting intersection of all of these different sort of identity concerns. Do I have you close to correct?
Yes, precisely.
Right, yeah. Well, you know,
Thank you.
my answer to that question would be that, first of all, we shouldn't look at, so it kind of goes back to, you know, valuing the journey over the destination in some sense, or at least valuing them as a piece with one another. We shouldn't be in a rush in some sense to find our ultimate identity, because if you do that, you'll miss it. You know, part of what makes us who we are is a sort of, you know, push back against the popular way of thinking about it in some respects. Part of what makes us who we are is, you know, what other people show us as being. not so much that I want to give you power to tell me who I am, but rather in the course of interacting with you and getting feedback from the world, serving you, you serving me, and our finding moments of both harmony and conflict, I learn about myself in a way to where I discover my deeper nature, and that grows, that develops over time, you know, in action, in interaction, you know, in relationship. And so having a vision of who we might be, that's a powerful thing. I think that's what we want to develop. But even that vision needs to be allowed to evolve along the journey of interactions and experiences that give it shape over time.
Tara, I know you have to leave us in a few minutes to go on a different kind of quest after this. So would you like to make your last word of the evening specifically in response to this excellent closing question?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the sort of most vital and useful elements of that kind of discourse is to, I think, challenge a wider notion in the American cultural consciousness that we can create ourselves ex nihilo, that what we want and what we want to be is all that who we are. I think that the language of identity, and particularly sort of the ways in which those identities might indeed intersect to, I think, are extraordinarily helpful, not least because I think they remind us how much of who we are is relational. We are always ourselves in relation to one another. This is sort of in terms of the experiences that we have, some of which we do not choose. The ways in which we navigate the world are formed by the people around us. My favorite sort of Dostoevsky quote is always from the Brothers Karamazov: "We are all responsible to one another for everything." And I think at its best, the discourse of intersectionality is an opportunity for us to kind of embrace and recognize the way in which we are, whether we want to be or not, vulnerable to others, and also that others are vulnerable to us, that the things we do, including, ways in which we might manifest privilege unjustly, that has an effect, that we are kind of all in this together and vulnerable to one another. And I think if the question remains, how do we talk about something kind of universal and distinct in the human person while sort of acknowledging the ways in which the experience of being a person in the world, both embodied and within a social context, is formative. Those are sort of the two poles we want to reconcile. And I like to think or talk in terms of the language of dignity and irreducibility rather than autonomy or freedom, because I think it's more useful. The idea is, how do we preserve the dignity of every human person in their specificity? How do we see them as irreducible, which is to say, not reducing them either to a kind of Enlightenment conception of a universal, or reduce them to a sort of network of categories, both of which sort of deny a sort of an irreducibility that's specific to the person. And yet doing so, part of that irreducibility is recognizing the ways in which experience and social experience play a huge role in that. So I think the idea that we can't talk about either a human sort of a fundamental that the language of fundamental shared humanity is incompatible with a kind of serious talk about ways in which identities might mean that it might make communication difficult, or might make a kind of a conversation difficult because people might be coming from different first principles or different places. I don't think that we have to pick an either or on that front. So I think I'll leave it there.
Well, Tara, John, thank you for a wonderful conversation tonight. And I must confess that after all this reflection and going back and forth on these various things, I think I have a little bit less of a sense of who I am in my authentic self now than I did an hour and a half ago when we started. But I think using some of the tools and ways of thinking about these things that we've been talking about, maybe I'll find my way back again. And I hope others can too. So I've appreciated this conversation. I just had a lot of fun with this. If everybody would be willing to join me in a nice round of jazz hands for our two speakers, Tara Isabella Burton and John Wood Jr. Thank you, you two, for helping us assess some of these great important issues on this front. And I will look forward, John, to seeing you on another event soon. And Tara, we will very much look forward to having you on an event soon. I know you said you have to get headed out for something soon, so you're free to go, Tara, but we'll still pitch your book in the chat. So with that being said, I'll just keep you all for just 2 minutes more real quick to go through the final details on this front. But Ibrahim, if you could go ahead and post those links in the chat, please. To follow John's work, John's commentary, John's general ideas and commentary and things, you can follow him at his Twitter handle, which is at John R. Wood Jr. We'll put that in the chat here in just a moment. And then if you'd like to follow Tara, and Tara writes prolifically, she has all kinds of commentaries coming out every other week, usually a couple times a month. You can follow her at her Twitter handle at NotoriousTIB. That is, in fact, a hip hop reference, and it is a very well done one. I guess it's also a Ruth Bader Ginsburg reference as well to some degree. But yeah, so follow those two on Twitter if you want to see their work as it comes out. You can also find them at various podcasts like the Braver Angels podcast and various other places. Additionally, Tara's book, Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, came out last year. It is excellent reading. I highly recommend it. We'll put the link for that in the chat too. And she has a couple books coming out this coming year, in the coming 2 years, including, as mentioned at the beginning, Self-Made, Curating Our Image from Da Vinci to the Kardashians, which again, I am quite excited to see that one that comes out. Meantime, you all just went through a fairly atypical Braver Angels event. Most Braver Angels events are much more small group focused, much more citizen to citizen conversation focused, and much more, I guess, kind of visceral in some ways, and in other ways, kind of less cerebral than this one was, right? And what we hope to do here in Braver Angels, we hope to bring a bunch of different kinds of conversation together to elevate the public discourse, to elevate our own ways of being citizens and engaging in these great issues of the public square. We don't ask people to change their particular political opinions. We change people to change their views about each other. And in the course of doing these various ways of engaging in the public square, from Braver Angels debates to Braver Angels workshops to Braver Angels one-on-ones to the America's Public Forum and everything in between, including volunteering with Braver Angels, which is one of the things that has been a wonderful thing in my life before I was hired full-time. And I was just volunteering enough that they decided to hire me full-time anyway, because it could get me more productive here. You know, that's how this kind of thing works out sometimes. Over the course of working with Braver Angels, I've just learned that there's a lot of different ways to change yourself to something that is not any different than your actual political self, your actual social self, but is in some ways just more capable of engaging in loving and charitable and humble conversation with people very different from you, from all walks of life, all across this wonderful American land. And you saw one example of that here. And one of the things I dearly hope to do with this America's Public Forum program over the next year and over the next many years, hopefully, is to do this kind of conversation and many more at various levels and all kinds of different fronts. So with that, the links for joining Braver Angels and for just finding out more about Braver Angels are in the chat. We encourage with open arms everybody to come join us for more events, come join us for more opportunities like this, try different kinds of events, try different kinds of workshops, and volunteer. We always need help. We always need more expertise on various things. And actually, as Ibrahim and Dennis can tell you, one of the things that I'm working on right now is building up the America's Public Forum volunteer team. So there will be openings to get more deeply involved with me if you think I'm not too annoying. So I would love to work with some of you if you'd be interested in doing that. Just take a look on those forums and we'll figure out some of these details soon. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a good time spending the next couple hours trying to find yourself. And I look forward to seeing you on future America's Public Forum events and other events. And let's go forward together and build a house united for the America we all want to be. Thank you, everybody. Good night, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Amen. Bye-bye.